morning. I'm Lindsay Wilson, so I'm going to be your moderator today. Parental rights is a hot topic these days, both in court, in public culture, and it is always highly politicized. We are here today as your panel to start this conference off, discussing this important current topic and including the legal and moral responsibilities and rights of parents as guardians versus what is taking place in the battlefields of the culture wars. We are seeing politicians across the country enact legislation requiring notification to parents if a child is under the age of 16 and wants to be called by a different pronoun or a different name, beginning in New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, and now out in Alberta. In Alberta, we're seeing this issue extend to medical intervention and to women's sports. Let me introduce our guests. We'll go in the middle here, the lovely Heidi McKillop. Heidi is the CEO and founder of ASN Productions. ASN stands for A Stranded Nation, paying tribute to Heidi's first documentary about Canada's energy industry. She has since produced multiple commercials, documentaries, and short films. She's committed to changing the negative public narrative of Canadian energy development and is currently working on an investigative documentary diving deep into the manufacturing footprint of green energy. She and her team have been speaking to landowners all over southern Alberta to capture a realistic perspective on the issue. And as it relates today, she celebrates having her first daughter, who is 1 year old, Miss Little Gracie Lynn. Next door here, we have the lovely Suzanne Sexton. Suzanne Sexton is a campaign and public relations consultant based in Manitoba. You'll likely recognize her as an energy sanity advocate and from being on the front lines politely challenging radical environmentalists and governments made up of radical environmentalists. She has one grown son. And then Krista Nicholson here, to my left, is a Calgary-based practicing lawyer for more than 30 years. Events through the pandemic have turned her sights from her former specialty in commercial litigation and insolvency to pursuing a new path, to becoming a civil rights and constitutional law lawyer. She's also working alongside a nonprofit or nonpartisan charity called Freedom's Advocate. She's well aware of the court challenges springing up around the country, as I mentioned above, and she's out there in the trenches. She also has one young adult daughter. I'm going to get started here. I want to read to you a very powerful quote from a Supreme Court justice that Krista shared with me yesterday. It's one from more than 20 years ago where the Supreme Court of Canada considered a challenge to a BC school board's decision to refuse to approve books suggested by a teacher depicting same-sex parented families for use at the K to grade 1 level. The Chief Justice stated, "The demand for tolerance cannot be interpreted as the demand to approve of another person's beliefs or practices. When we ask people to be tolerant of others, we do not ask them to abandon their personal convictions. We merely ask them to respect the rights, values, and ways of being of those who may not share those convictions. The belief that others are entitled to equal respect depends not on the belief that their values are right, but on the belief that they have a claim to equal respect regardless of whether they are right. Learning about tolerance is therefore learning that other people's entitlement to respect from us does not depend on whether their views accord with their own." So with that being said, as this sets the tone for our panel, I would like to start with Krista, as she is our panel's lawyer.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. Hopefully you can hear me. It's my pleasure to speak to you this morning. Talk to you a little bit about parental rights and their responsibilities as well. As you heard, I'm currently retained by a client who's a prospective intervener in the Saskatchewan pronoun case, and I'm in the process of being retained in the Alberta proceedings, which are anticipated. So my work on those cases, as you've heard, is supported by a charity called Freedom's Advocate. It's a nonpartisan charity, and they raise money to help support clients with cases in human rights and constitutional law. So this morning, there's a couple of things that I'd like to talk to you about. First, to get us started, I would like to frame the legal aspect of the controversy relating to parental rights. After that, I want to take you, if there's an opportunity, take you, and I think it'll be useful for you to hear about the legal framework, including the sources of law And I'll try and tie that into the Saskatchewan litigation so that you have a feel for that as well. So to begin then, framing the controversy, of course, parental rights involve complex legal and social issues, and they arise in different contexts, including education, healthcare, custody, and decision-making for minors. The term parental or parents' rights is a convenient shorthand. The rights in question also apply to caretakers who are not the child's biological parents, such as foster parents or other guardians. So what's the controversy? What's going on? Now, the reality is that parental rights have been recognized by the highest court in Canada. These rights can be seen as relating to parental responsibilities in one sense. I wanted you to hear directly from the judge who made a leading decision, which is in the case of BR versus Children's Aid Society of Metropolitan Toronto. I'll call that BR for short because it'll come up again. It's from 1995, and this is what Justice Laforêt said. He said, while acknowledging that parents bear responsibilities towards their children, it seems to me that they must enjoy correlative rights to exercise them. The common law has always, in the absence of demonstrated neglect or unsuitability, presumed that parents should make all significant choices affecting their children, and has afforded to the parents a general liberty to do as they choose. This liberty interest is not a parental right tantamount to a right of property in children. Fortunately, we have distanced ourselves from the ancient juridical conception of children as chattels of their parents. The state is now actively involved in a number of areas traditionally conceived of as properly belonging to the private sphere. Nonetheless, our society is far from having repudiated the privileged role parents exercise in the upbringing of their children. This role translates into a protected sphere of parental decision-making, which is rooted in the presumption that parents should make important decisions affecting their children, both because parents are more likely to appreciate the best interests of the children and because the state is ill-equipped to make such decisions itself. So even though these parental rights are recognized in the way that I said, there is a battle going on, and that takes place in academia. And one Canadian lawyer, whose name is Mark Carter, wrote an article back in 1994 called Debunking Parents' Rights in the Canadian Constitutional Context. He referred to a number of articles. One of them was written by an American named James Dwyer. And what Carter said is there's really a tension going on, or there's two theories or approaches to children's rights. One is a really strong children's rights perspective that assumes children have the same rights as the adults. And standing in opposition to that, another American academic named David Archer calls the opposition to that the caretaker thesis. So what's the caretaker thesis? It argues that children lack the competence or capacity to engage in the kind of self-determining choices that rights and freedoms facilitate. So Carter argues that children should have the children should have the rights, and the parents should only have privileges and not rights. So what might be the implications of that approach? Well, the American author explains it this way. He says, rather than balancing the parents' rights against the state's rights regarding the care and education of the child, as this presently occurs, instead, judges would take these conflicts solely on the basis and resolve the conflicts solely on the basis of the welfare interests of the child. So in Canada, we call that the best interests of the child. And then what he says is this: doing that, in other words, favoring judge decisions over the balancing, would likely in turn alter the precise limits of parental freedom and authority, and shift the boundary between permissible and impermissible state interventions. So what we have then, or what's being advocated here, is that judges, of course, judges depend on experts like doctors and psychologists and social workers and other professionals. So we would see them potentially weighing into prior to this, the privileges and the privileged sphere that parents have. So this is the tension. Who's really to make these decisions? And in the end, I think one way of thinking about this as well are these two theories. One with the parental, the competence, the lacking the competence, the caretaker thesis, that is kind of bridged with the rights of children by the doctrine called mature minor. So the courts have recognized, especially in the medical field, that mature minors who are competent, there's a scale of competence. So the court is recognizing that on the one hand, they don't have competence, young children, but as they grow older, they will have more and more competence, and so they can begin to make these decisions. Now, in the end, has the court allowed a mature minor to make a medical decision contrary to their best interests? No, they haven't. In those cases, the state does still step in on the basis of the child needing to be protected from itself. In that case, it was a Jehovah's Witness young person who had decided not to have a blood transfusion, and the state intervened and said, no, we aren't going to accept the mature minor's view. So that's kind of a sense of the controversy that's going on, the tension, and a little bit of the battlefield out there. So I'll turn it over.
No, thank you. That's a really good broad scope of how we should look at that. There's no shortage of this in the culture wars, that's for sure. I think we'll hop over to you, Suzanne. How do we talk about this without getting supercharged? How do we talk about this to the very normal, non-political people? How do we talk to them about a parent's right to be informed?
Well, conservatives, we love to get our messaging wrong. We like to talk about how we feel while criticizing other people for having feelings. So we have to think about how our completely normal people, who this is not a mission they are on in their lives, who are struggling trying to pay bills, struggling trying to raise children, how do we talk to them? How do they receive our messages? Because kids coming home from schools these days have been told this is an issue about being fair and about being nice, and they're told that they are moral champions for protecting transgender people and protecting the rights. So how do you come across when they've been told you're evil? You can't come on strong, right? You have to remember, we're having a conversation, not a battle. We have to use words that are reasonable. It might feel really good to use strong terms and to believe that in the keyboard warrior sense, that being strong is important, but maybe we need some understanding. We could see in the Manitoba election that they had the vast majority of the public on their side on this issue, but when it came for the way that they messaged it, they ended up losing an election. So let's be a little sensible. Let's have conversations, not battles. Let's remember that the people on the other side think they're doing the right thing. So when we come out with our values, we don't want it to be a weapon that we're hitting them over the head with, that they want to run away from and the conversation's over. Let's bring out our values and say, hey, I like individual rights. I think you have every right as an adult to live however you want, and I think your parents have a role to be informed too, because that's protecting you. So let's remember how other people receive our messages instead of trying to make ourselves look cool online.
And I think when we go through that lens and that approach, you know, it's not fair when the media jumps all over this. It's not fair to ever make the presumption. I believe, and I want to choose to believe as a mom of 3 kids, that most parents, the vast majority of parents, no matter what their political views or their personal religious or moral views, they want the best for their children, and they will love and protect them no matter what their choices are regarding gender or sexuality. So I think we need to be more positive about that and not assume that there's nearly the number of evil parents out there or abusive parents out there when it comes to these circumstances that maybe the media sometimes would portray.
Who are those parents?
Yeah, who are they? I don't know any of them, and I know a lot of parents. So.
Yeah, and they're told they're doing the right thing. Their kids come home from school and say, this is an important thing we need to do. And they believe they're doing the right thing and that they're taking a kind and compassionate position. So to tell them they're wrong outright isn't going to work. I mean, it's a conversation. So you have to engage on their terms and explain why we're also kind and compassionate and why protecting children is kind and compassionate.
Heidi, I think we'll go over to you here. What about the well-being of kids? Are they endangered or are they made safer by strong parental rights?
This is a really interesting topic because I feel like my mom is actually a supply teacher in New Brunswick, and she's been teaching for 30 years in the school system. I get really concerned about this topic from the perspective and the relationship between kids going to school and us as parents. We don't need to divide our households and the school system. It's already hard enough keeping a child alive. The last thing we want to do is be fighting with teachers at school. Let's be honest. Like, we're in survival mode as moms most of the time. And Premier Blaine Higgs has done a really good job at being the front runner of this conversation. It's a really difficult thing to bring up in public, but ultimately, I mean, I am pretty conservative, obviously, in this approach, but I mean, no one's going to know better what my daughter needs than me, you know, and I'm a new mom. I'm coming in mama bear mode all the time, and I get really offended when I hear, you know, if whatever happens to her at school is not my responsibility once she's in the school system. And, you know, when I talk to teachers, they're very confused because they're going from administration from the top down. And a lot of these things kind of play into account of how we're having this discussion as a whole. And I really do have empathy for teachers because it's so hard to teach kids nowadays. And there's a lot of policy now that is affecting how they interact with children in the classroom. And that's just something that we don't want to indulge in as conservatives. I think we need to be very clear about this conversation. We need to be direct and say, you know, our household, our family is first. You know, that is, as conservatives, we put our children above ourselves before we do as parents every day. And I think that's something that, you know, I'm really proud to say conservatives have done a really good job on. And I think we need to be a little bit more vocal about that long term.
Sure, get off the defense, right? And be
Yep.
unapologetic about just loving our
Absolutely.
kids. Yeah,
Totally.
For sure. I think we'll bring this back to you, Krista. I think kind of let's take this back into the legal framework, right? We're here and we're in the trenches and talking about culture wars, but
Sure,
if you can bring
happy
it
to
back.
do that. So now I'm going to get to the second thing I hope to tell you about, so that's great. Parental rights and responsibilities in Canada are influenced by various sources. We have the criminal law as a starting point. That's Section 215, Sub 1 of the Criminal Code. It sets out the parental responsibility from the criminal's perspective, and it requires a parent to provide the necessities of life to children under 16 years of age. In addition to the criminal law, there's the common law, and that can be understood as judge-made law. And you may have heard politicians like Premier Moe or Premier Smith, and I just haven't heard Premier Higgs say this exactly, so I don't want to put it on him, but those two premiers, at the very least, have said that parents are in the best position to make decisions which are for the benefit of their children. And here, for the reasons I already outlined and gave you the long quote from the Supreme Court of Canada Justice, these premiers are on very solid legal territory here. And that's because, again, from that quote from the Supreme Court judge that I read, the common law has long recognized that parents are in the best position to take care of their children and make all decisions necessary to ensure their well-being. Now, the rights of caregivers and teachers are derived from the rights of parents who, at common law, delegate their obligations and prerogatives to others. So that's how the teacher gets their authority. So it's through the parent. In addition to the common law, there's federal and provincial and territorial laws that govern human rights and family matters that include custody, access, and parental responsibilities, including the highest law of the land is being the Charter, the Constitution, and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is part of that Constitution. For example, on the human rights front, before I turn to tell you about the Charter, on the human rights front, in Alberta, the Alberta Bill of Rights contains a right of parents to make informed decisions respecting the education of their children. So that's expressly part of the Alberta Bill of Rights, and other provinces may well have that kind of express language as well. Now, turning to the Charter, what it does, by way of reminder, is it protects individuals from state interference regarding certain fundamental freedoms, which can intersect with parental rights. And what are the rights that intersect with parental rights? One of them is pursuant to Section 2 of the Charter. It is freedom of religion, conscience, and expression. And many of these parental rights cases touch on and engage this right. And this is one of the strongest areas that the Supreme Court has spoken about. There's also been a very strong decision out of the Ontario Court of Appeal that's quite recent, from 2017. And what that decision says is that the law recognizes the central role of parents in education and their concomitant rights. And it quotes from the Supreme Court saying the constitutional freedom of religion includes the right to educate and rear their children in the tenets of the faith. And then until the child reaches an age where they can make an independent decision regarding their own religious beliefs, the parents decide the religion for the child and raise them in accordance with that religion. So that's the Supreme Court in Ontario. And in addition, in a homeschooling case of the Supreme Court of Canada, the court said those who administer the province's educational requirements may not do so in a manner that unreasonably infringes the right of parents to teach their children in accordance with their religious convictions, subject always to Section 1 of the Charter, and I'll take you to that in a moment. So that, in addition, there's one more strong statement, which is this, from the same judge that I had read to you before on that BR case. He says, "It seems to me that the right of parents to rear their children according to their religious beliefs, including choosing medical and other treatment, is a fundamental aspect of freedom of religion." So in addition to Section 2, there's also Section 7 of the Charter that protects the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and not to be deprived thereof by the state except in accordance with principles of fundamental justice. Now, this issue has arisen in the Saskatchewan legal proceedings. In that case, we have the applicant named UR Pride Center for Sexual and Gender Diversity. It claims that children have the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. And it asserts that a public school teacher, who's essentially an arm of the state, and who, because of the Saskatchewan legislation, is, they say, forced to misgender, is the term they use, dead name, or use the birth name of a person who's chosen a different name, violates that claimed right. So the child has these rights, and those rights are being violated, they say, by the legislation. And this is what, in the BR case, dating back to 1995, again, Justice Laforet said, "I would have thought it plain that the right to nurture a child, to care for its development, and to make decisions for it in the fundamental matters such as medical care are part of the liberty interest of the parent." So I talked earlier about the religious interest of the parent, which was protected, and now we have the right of the parent as part of its liberty interest to deal with nurture the child and make medical decisions in respect of it. That's Section 12, or Section 7, sorry. I'm going to now turn to Section 12, and this is a very interesting section. it says that every person has the right not to be subjected to cruel and unusual treatment or punishment by the state. This issue has also arisen in the Saskatchewan proceedings on account of the applicant, which I'll call our Pride, claiming that children have the right, this right, not to face cruel and unusual treatment, and that the school is violating that right because of the legislation, which they say causes the teacher to misgender or dead name or not use the preferred pronoun of the student under 16 years of age. Now, what's really interesting here is that the government of Saskatchewan, when they implemented their legislation, they invoked the notwithstanding clause with respect to certain sections, in respect of Section 7, which I told you about, life, liberty, and security of the person, and Section 15, which I will tell you about. They also invoked it with respect to the religious claim as well under Section 2. What they didn't do is invoke it with respect to Section 12. And so this case is currently now before the Court of Appeal in Saskatchewan, and the issue needs to be decided as to whether, among other things, this Section 12 challenge can proceed. And it may well be that once that the Court of Appeal will decide that Section 12 can proceed, because one of the reasons would be that it's not covered by the notwithstanding clause. So that's a very interesting issue. Now, what's a further right that's at issue is Section 15. That's the equality right. Again, in Saskatchewan, this is at issue because UR Pride says that the legislation disproportionately affects gender diverse students when compared to non-gender diverse students. So, as well, that all of these charter rights that I've told you about can be limited, but the limitation, this is under Section 1 of the Charter, has to be both prescribed by law and demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So in addition to all of those types of law, the criminal, the common law, the legislative, the statutes, the bills of rights, and the charter, in addition to those, there's also international agreements as a source of parental law. And those include there are a number of them. There's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That provides that parents have a prior right to choose the child's education, and also stipulates that family is the fundamental group unit in society, and it's entitled to protection by society and the state. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is respect for the liberty of parents to deal with their moral obligations and religious rights to raise them in conformity with their views. In addition, there's the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Those uphold the rights of children as well. So these are international agreements. They are often referred to by courts, and there's always a sense of whether, or a question as to whether or not they have been fully ratified by the government. And so, while they're referenced, they're mostly referenced out of interest and not because they are binding, but they have influence. And so that's really the framework. And a little bit about the Saskatchewan case and how practically that framework is being implemented in the courthouse, in the courtroom.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Heidi, as the newest mom of the bunch, what do you worry about as your daughter gets older and this is so divisive and there's so much toxicity? When I think from our conversation up here, we can get, it doesn't need to be that way.
Yep.
How does that concern you or keep you up at night when you think about that and she enters her school years in the next few years?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's something that is to be said in the city centers, and I recently just moved to Okotoks outside of Calgary for this reason, because I don't want my daughter in the school system in Calgary. And I get concerned because I'm like, when you get into a broader audience, then you have more opinions, you have a lot more of these issues kind of arising. And, you know, I want to shelter my daughter from these issues as much as I can as a parent. You know, I just want her to be a kid. I want her to grow up the way that I grew up in, you know, the 80s and the 90s. It was a bit of a free-for-all, let's be honest. Our parents did a lot of really funny things. But I think there's a value center there that I really appreciate that my parents gave me the opportunity to be a kid. I grew up in rural New Brunswick, Harvey Station, and I just loved my childhood. I remember, going to church. I remember going and playing in the school ground, and I remember going to my friends' houses. And there really wasn't a conversation like this at a young age. And that's what I worry about, is like, it's okay to debate this as adults, and I have all the empathy and all the, thought that goes into these conversations, when we get older. But children in grade 4 and under, and even in, middle school, I mean, come on, guys. These kids they need to be sheltered, and this is our job to protect them from these kind of adversities that are coming down the pipeline. And I just kind of find it shocking, to be honest with you. I'm like, that this is even a debate in our society at this point.
Mm-hmm. Suzanne, do you find it shocking how much that this is kind of pushed at children at a young age to be thinking about or talking about before they're really even aware of sexuality really at all?
To be cynical? No, because it's a political wedge, and it's a very successful political wedge right now. That's why we need to be careful talking about our values and considering the other person's point of view and continuing a conversation. When the conversation is over, that means somebody has won. So we need to keep the conversation going and make sure people understand us instead of us feeling really good. But also, building on what Heidi just said, there are bad teachers, there are bad parents. We have rights and responsibilities that need to be balanced, and we have to be very considerate about how we balance that. But even last week, another Canadian teacher was charged with sexual assaults and sexual interference. And let's just say, if we're telling our children it's okay for teachers to keep secrets from parents, what does that set us up for? Our children can be easily extorted and blackmailed, and we're setting them up for abuse. That's not reasonable, and it's not responsible. So our responsibility is to accept that there's bad people on both spectrums. The majority of people are good, and as good people, we're going to try to protect them from that. We can't start a war with teachers because they are raising our children. We can't all go and homeschool because somebody has to go to work. So we just have to be considerate of that. And our children, we don't put them in a car as a young child and say, here's the keys, figure it out. We say, here's a learner's permit, let's go together on this. So I think parents need to stay involved. Parents need to be informed what's going on, and there can't be any secrets because that's safe and responsible.
And again, I think
Well said.
I just want to reiterate that I think we can all acknowledge it is really hard to be a teacher. My late mother was a teacher, and I think
My mother's
it
a
is,
teacher.
It's
That's amazing.
It's a tough thing for them. So kudos
Totally.
to all the great teachers out there. There are many, many, many of you out there.
And can you imagine, like, how they must feel in this conversation? Like, let's just put ourselves aside as parents for a couple of minutes. They are constantly under different administrations, whether it's conservative or liberals or, God forbid, the NDP in power, is that there's different political things that happen. And every time a new administration reoccurs, they have to create an entirely different curriculum. And they're already stressed out, maxed out. They don't have the energy and frankly, the capacity to handle this conversation in the classroom. They're just surviving just like we are as parents. And when we're in survival mode, that's not a good conversation to start this. Like, how are they more responsible for our kids than we are at home? That's the most important question to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. Family first, for sure. Krista?
Yes.
So when somebody asks you, does Canadian law protect family rights? What's kind of the short answer to that?
Well, the short answer is that the Canadian Bill of Rights actually references specifically the family unit in its preamble. However, the Charter does not specifically address it at all. and expressly. And the reason, or the thinking behind it is that the Charter relates to individual rights, although there are exceptions that are addressed in the Constitution, including relating to Indigenous people and also Quebec. And so it's focused on individuals and not this family unit. People are trying to make arguments about that. You heard some of the international sources of law that I mentioned do talk about the family unit being the primary unit and being entitled to protection by the state and in society. So this is kind of an issue that's a little bit up for grabs, but definitely the Charter does not specifically provide for family rights.
Case in point, we're in the mud with all this stuff. Suzanne, I like to think that you're very good at kind of looking holistically at what's happening with media and pop culture around the country. So if you were to identify some of these trends, where do you think this is all heading? Because it's really kind of come to a head, and it's pretty heavy right now. Where do you think? But everything goes in trends, right? Everything ebbs and flows. What do you think?
Well, like I said, when the conversation is over, somebody's won. So we have to keep the conversation going until we see our values reflected in other people, or at least we come to a polite consensus where the public is comfortable that we've got the balance right. As far as the left, it's a very efficient political wedge for them. This is bait for conservatives because there's always somebody that doesn't think about how the messaging is going to land or that takes it too far. And we have to be really cautious about that while not giving up. Leading with conviction means that we're in the battle and we haven't been instantly dismissed. If you come on too strong, you're instantly dismissed. You're not talking in the words that people are comfortable in. If you're not talking about kindness and compassion and protecting children, and you're talking about my rights as a parent only, and you aren't talking about we want what's best for children, then we're not doing a good job. I'd like you to picture in your heads, what's your idea of a conservative parent's success? Do you have a picture in your head of what a conservative parent that's successful is? Because I think if our children are intellectually, emotionally, and physically capable of living their lives when they hit adulthood, I think we've done a good job. And we've instilled our own values in them, but we're not imposing our values on other people. And if our children are capable of having these kinds of conversations and thinking about rights and responsibilities and balancing them properly, then I think we're kind of successful.
Thank you. It is interesting, though, that this is really up for debate when you think about it. I mean, you can't vote till a certain age. You can't buy alcohol till a certain age. You can't drive a car till a certain age. But these are really big decisions for children to be making when we're not deeming them legally, capable of doing other things that I would think are less impactful on their day-to-day lives. Heidi, do you have anything to add to that?
You know what, just what you said, Lindsay, is that there's something that's to be said with, I always think about this in the media perspective because I do documentaries and I'm a little bit more on that perspective, is when Premier Smith came out with the stance, which I think it's pretty neutral for the most part. I mean, I guess we're conservatives, so obviously we're inherently biased in this conversation in this room. But it was really fascinating is the media just decimated her. They were like, she's homophobic, she's all this stuff. And I remember reading all those news articles and I'm like, golly, I wish, I feel bad for our conservative politicians nowadays to make any kind of a value statement is inherently to say that you're against a certain group. That's really destructive for society. I don't think as conservatives that is our goal. I don't think that is our conversation. I think that we always have this notion of family first, and we're thinking about that as a whole. And I'm really proud to be part of this movement and part of this conversation because this is something that I think is a core value that I want to instill in my daughter as she gets older. And I think that our politicians that have publicly come out, like Premier Higgs and Premier Smith and Premier Scott Moe, they really have taken it on the chin for the most part in society, and they've taken the burden off of us to have this conversation. But I mean, I guess I'm a new mom, but again, this kind of goes down to, but like, just don't mess with moms.
Don't mess with moms.
Don't mess with moms.
Agreed. I think we'll move into, we just have 5 minutes left here, so I think we'll move into just closing remarks. What I want you each to tell me what you want the people in this room to leave here with today. We'll start with you, Krista. What do you want the people to take out of here today?
I think the key takeaway should just be a sense of that there are parental rights that's been established by the courts, but the territory is shifting a little bit, and perhaps in a proper way, to have regard for children as they grow and mature. So the mature minor doctrine has a place, but in the end, we're really deciding about what parents are doing, and we've heard, and we all know, it seems, most parents are doing a good job. They're doing a decent job. And so the general standard that exists, which is that of neglect, if you're neglecting the child or you're like an unsuitable parent, that seems to be an appropriate intervention point for the state. For sure, absolutely. So should we have the state now deciding the best interests of the child? And the court has said, no, what we want to do so far is keep that with the parents. And why? Because the state's not really in a position to do that. But our state has grown, and our state has grown, and the state has become more interested, and professionals are more engaged. And it may be because of the breakdown in even the family unit and the structures that are now causing the state to need to become more engaged. And so I think those are the issues that I think we need to think about, and we can backtrack it into, from a political perspective for you in the room, how do we shore that up? How do we help the underpinnings to keep, if you believe that family is the right place for kids to grow up, if you believe that parents should act reasonably, they can't harm children. This is not a private sphere where parents can do anything. I think nobody is saying that when we talk about parental rights. But if we can figure out the underpinnings, the underlying issues, and try and shore those up from a political perspective, I think we may be able to keep the balance right. The worse and worse these problems become, the more and more the state feels a need to intervene. And so those would be my parting comments for you to think about going forward.
Thank you, that's awesome. We've got 1 minute each. We'll go to you, Heidi, and we'll close with you, Suzanne. Takeaway.
I think the most important thing I've been thinking about for the last few days is what you said to me on the phone the other day, is that as conservatives, we need to not be afraid about leaning into conversations like this. I think we shy away from emotional conversation as a whole. And this is something that I've seen in oil and gas, I've seen it in my work as a documentarian, is that we need to be proud of what we do as a whole. We are a family unit. We really should be proud of the morals and the values that we present to society. And we may not change very rapidly. That's kind of a little bit of our niche that maybe we could work on a little bit better. But at the same time, I love that we are consistent. And I think that is a voice that, I want to have as a parent, is to say consistent and provide for my daughter long term.
I love that. Thank you. Suzanne, final minute.
Well, if we're leaders with conviction, that means we have to have the opportunity to lead. That means that we have to talk to the public in a way that they understand, and that we have to win elections. If you don't win elections, you aren't leading anything. So let's be mindful about what we're saying out there. Let's be mindful of who we have on our team and how the public is going to take us in. So use a friendly face, keep your smile on, think about the way that someone who's been told for 2, 3, 4 years now in school, think about how they are going to instantly reject your message, or they're going to take it in and go, you're not wrong, I understand your point. Those things are how we build the conversations. And ultimately, we need to win elections. We can't give up on our convictions, but we have to be careful that people understand us. I think Danielle Smith did an absolutely incredible job at explaining herself, and the unions and the activists, all arguments failed because she did a great job of explaining herself. She said enough. So I think that's where we have to be.
Well, that was a great way to start our morning. I'd like to thank our guests here, Suzanne Sexton, Heidi McKillop, and Kristen Nicholson. Thank you very much for joining me on stage today, and thank you all.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you.
Thank you.